Hello there. This video may annoy some people or even upset them, but well, that's just tough. I think certain things have to be said, and to my mind, truth is more important than people's feelings. So, if something is true and you say it and it upsets people, well, that's just their problem if they can't handle what is actually truth. And one of the big problems we're seeing today is people trying to redefine what truth is. And that's the subject of this video, is the rewriting of history, which is not just a problem in Ireland, but all over the world where, okay, fair enough, you could say that a lot of history as we know it is extremely biased, written by the victors, propaganda in many cases. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is up for grabs to be rewritten, reinterpreted, and sort of re-engineered even to suit modern political tastes. And in particular, I'm talking about, the woke crowd who love to take history and reinvent it, not based on actual facts, but based on an idealized version of what they think history should be. And I've no time for that whatsoever, because if it's not based on actual information that we can verify, then it's just conjecture, it's speculation, it's basically creating fiction out of history. So, there's a tendency in recent years, I've noticed with Irish history, to sort of try to reinvent it, like trying to suggest certain things about Ireland. One thing would be about the black Irish. That actually just refers to people's hair. The colour black dove it's more about that. It's not this suggestion that there were like people from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa here or something like that is really fictitious. We do know that Egyptians came here, or at least for sure their trade items were here. It's very likely that a character who we came to know as Scotia or Scotter came here with the Malaysians, and she'd migrated from Egypt, where she was called Mary Taton, and she may have had an entourage. But as we know, the Egyptians were sort of like pale brown people. They weren't sub-Saharan Africans. They were North Africans, quite a different ethnic group of people. And of course there's been huge overlap over time between sort of people from north of the Mediterranean and on the south side of the Mediterranean. So you've got, of course, across Europe huge mixing of peoples, and again in Ireland, but this sort of myth that there was never a homogenous group in Ireland that's been touted by Micheál Martin and among others, our Taoiseach, is absolutely completely untrue. For thousands of years, you had a sort of fairly homogenous society, which was disrupted to some extent by the arrival of the Vikings for a period of about a bit over 200 years. That caused a lot of disruption. But they're quite a small group, and they have influenced genetics in Ireland, as had the earlier invasions from Spain. There's a definite link there that can be detected in the gene pool. And also there's a small amount of genetic input from the Normans and the later English. You have to bear in mind that the Normans, when they came here, were only about just over 1,000 people to start with, and they created havoc, and then they came back with somewhat larger force. But that was comprised of Norman French, of Flemish, of Belgians, and a small amount of Welsh people. You get the English arriving much later, actually, in truth. The early kind of Norman settlers were all basically sort of descended from the Vikings and merged with some French people, mostly Viking, in fact. because they had settled northwest France in exchange for leaving the French alone. Basically, they were given a large chunk of northwest France. So that, I mean, that's just one example, but you also have things like the reassessment of Irish gods and goddesses, a sort of attempt to sort of sanitize the Morrigan, which many would interpret in the past as just a war goddess and an embodiment of violence and destruction and sort of terror and revenge. But that's been sort of reinterpreted for the sort of feminist age. And the same can be applied to Crom, who would appear to be a very savage god that requires, a human sacrifice. There would have obviously been some kind of very negative cult around Crom. Just as, there's a very nasty cult of Thuggee in India around Kali, which has some similarities, you could say, with both Crom and Morrigan. Not really very nice, although now we're supposed to believe it's all cuddly and friendly and they weren't horrible at all. But if you look at Irish history, you'll see there's bog burials where people have been killed. Possibly you could suggest that they were sacrificial volunteers rather than victims. But it's been suggested that people like robbers and murderers and rapists were sort of sacrificed to the gods. That doesn't seem that unlikely. There's a huge amount of human sacrifice going on in history. The Romans criticized the Carthaginians for this, but the Phoenicians, were sacrificing their firstborns to Baal. But the Romans themselves, up until sort of the end of the Republic almost, were doing human sacrifices, and they continued doing animal sacrifices right through to the end of paganism, really in the 5th century in Rome. So there's a lot of precedence for sort of rather unpleasant behaviour. If you look at Ireland, you have the Moog and the Cumo, which are the two types of slave. Yeah, I'm not joking, slaves in Ireland. That was a normal thing under Brehon law, which predated, obviously, the Norman laws. In general, you could say that Brehon law was a lot more restorative as opposed to punitive. For instance, if I killed your cow, I would then have to restore the value of that cow somehow, either by, giving another cow a replacement and a little bit extra, or some other thing that's equivalent, rather than me being locked up or stabbed or punished in that way. Most of the laws seem to be about restoration as opposed to punishment. Although you do have some rather bizarre behaviours in that respect. I suppose you wouldn't really call it punishment, but sort of taking violent actions to prevent certain courses. If you were a royal person, it was a tradition that you had to be whole. So you had a horrible situation where someone who might be a chief or a local king, a provincial king, or even the Ard Rí, the High King, may decide to maim their male relatives by removing an eye, removing a hand, removing an ear, so that they are uneligible under Brehon law to become king ever. So it's a really nasty thing to do. Imagine your brother there and you think, oh, well, he might take my throne, so I'm going to take one of his eyes out. That's really rather nasty, isn't it? Then you have countless examples in Irish history of, intertribal warfare, where they do things like going and chopping down somebody's, another tribe's sacred tree, setting fire to their towns. One of the problems that led to the Normans was Dermot MacMurrough, was having a feud with Rory O'Connor. They would attack each other. In fact, not long after the first Norman attempted invasion, a little while after, I think, Dermot MacMurrough's capital in Ferns was burnt to the ground, completely destroyed. And a lot of his family were dispossessed. Later on, you had people like Art McMurrough who kind of re-established themselves. But, it wasn't uncommon for people to behave in like really ridiculous ways. And you could even suggest that the Irish themselves hated each other more than they hated the Normans, because sometimes they would form alliances with the Vikings and later with the Normans against their tribal enemies. So, it's well recorded in much of the annals and in historical legend of like the book of the Taking of Ireland, about the wars going on between the different provinces. Famously, Cuchulain's feud with Queen Maeve of Connaught. So Ulster versus Connaught is a big theme there. And you see that again, warring with the Leinstermen. The Ultonians or the Ulstermen always seem to be at war with somebody more or less. But all four and sometimes five provinces were all fighting amongst each other. And of course the fifth province they just actually disappeared altogether thanks to all this feuding. So there's this sort of rose-tinted spectacles glorified version of Irish history. Everyone was lovely, nobody was ever mean to each other. Everything's the fault of the British, and the Irish never did anything bad to each other. I mean, if you even go as far as looking at the famine in Ireland, you have cases of where the food was prepared. Originally with soup it would have been made, but then later on a decision to make things fairer, supposedly, was to give out the ingredients for making soup to people. You had cases where people who were quite wealthy, that didn't need the food, they'd come and take all the food, and then the paupers from the surrounding area, who of course didn't have carts, they didn't have horses and donkeys, they had to walk, they would arrive in to get the ingredients, and it would all be gone because the greedy, horrible people who didn't even need it had taken it all, and then leaving the poor to starve to death. So you can blame a hell of a lot on the British, that's for sure. Incompetence, a laissez-faire attitude, but attempts to actually help people were undermined by extremely greedy Irish people, even to the extent of like bakers in Dingle doubling the price of bread just because they could get away with it, not because it was necessary. They just knew that people were desperate, they would pay anything for food. So there's this really, really disgusting exploitation of people's suffering. So you see that, as I said, you see that in Irish history with the slaves. You could, in theory, become free, but you had a very hierarchical society where you had the king and the druids at the top. It was somewhat like the caste system in India that still exists today. Very, very rigid and not much room for vertical movement. And of course, if you look at many people who've left Ireland, a lot of Irish people were involved in the slave trade in the New World, in the Caribbean and in the Americas, and they were quite happy to buy and sell people to make a big profit. So I think there's a very distorted, sort of sanitized view of the Irish, as if they're somehow morally superior to their neighbours. Not just like they say, oh well, the British and their evil empire, and then the Spanish evil empire. Although generally people look very favourably towards the Spanish in Ireland because of the people from the Armada that settled sort of on the west coast of Galway, and their attempts to help with the emancipation of Catholic Ireland. And the same goes for France. But I mean, the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish actually arguably did far worse atrocities than the British Empire ever did. Certainly the Spanish were responsible for the very first concentration camp in Cuba, and the slaughter and genociding of people, literally just murdering them and leaving piles of their bones into a warehouse or something. So I think there's just a tremendous amount of bias and a tremendous amount of desire to sort of pretend that somehow Irish history is different from anywhere else. There's been horrible, nasty deeds be done by people in the past, and it's been the same everywhere. Even if you look at places like North America, there's a sort of general sort of benign view taken of Native American tribes that they were lovely, lived in harmony and peace, but they were at war with each other all the time, and they did horrible atrocities to each other. That's not to excuse what happened. The mistreatment of the Native Americans in North America is well recorded and entirely valid. But we shouldn't think that they were these amazingly peaceful people. They weren't. They were violent and aggressive, and they would go to war with each other if it suited them. And that's very much the case in Ireland. If you know anything about Irish history, you'll know that going right back way into the pagan era, the Irish kingdoms are all fighting against each other all of the time, constantly. And even during dealing with invaders, they continue to do this. And that's just the sad truth of history, where you have rather than having a united country under one ruler, where you have a multitude of different kingdoms and different clans with competing interests, they will often betray each other, just do the dirt on each other, attempt to assassinate each other's leaders, and sort of just doing raiding and sort of burning crops, things like that, slaughtering your opponents, taking people as slaves, etc. This is all part of Irish history. It has nothing to do with Britain or the Normans or anything like that. It's just there. And I think we have to be honest about the past, instead of trying to reinvent it and trying to insert types of people that weren't there, or pretend that all the leaders of Irish society, the Gaelic order, if you like, were all wonderful, humane, kind people, because many of them weren't. They were just as flawed, just as greedy, just as manipulative and cruel as anybody else's leaders. History is full of very nasty struggles, unfortunately. And I think we have to look at things in a more nuanced way and try to unpick what really happened. Of course, there are always versions. The victory gets to write the story usually. The victorious will obviously portray the losers as bad, etc., whatever. But if you look at it more dispassionately and you try and take evidence from both sides in a war, for instance, then you usually get a picture where both sides are prepared to do quite terrible things to their opponents in order to win. It's not very nice, and but that's humans. That's unfortunately, humans have a history of being violent, of being deceptive, dishonest, and quite often incredibly cruel if they want to achieve certain goals. So I really love Ireland and I love the history, but I don't like to see people sort of putting a twist on it that is completely false. And unfortunately, that's quite often what happens. Maybe trying to serve some political agenda of today to try to make the past fit the narrative that they want to push. And I don't believe that's a good thing to do. I think we should try to be as honest about the past as we can. Anyway, that's enough of a rant for now. Hope you found that interesting. Please subscribe if you're not subscribed. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you have time, go back and have a look through some of my older videos. I've got several different playlists that you might find interesting. Okay, thanks for watching, and bye for now.